Dave, thank you so much for joining me today on the What is a Good Life podcast. Since speaking to you last and just coming away from that conversation with such a strong impression of, God, that sounds like quite a good life. I was really looking forward to speaking with you today.
Mm. And likewise, Mark. I think it was as wonderful a conversation for me too. I just found the flow and the emerging nature of it just beautiful. Yeah, it's always a joy to be in conversations like that. Very real.
So, Dave, as you're aware, the question that I kick things off with is there a question you're exploring as you move through life?
Yeah, I think there is. It's funny when I was thinking about the conversation that we might have, and that being the only known question as such, or at least the one we start with. I came across something in the last few days which sort of sharpened it for me, and I think I've been at this unconsciously. This is a roundabout way of answering your question, and that is this sense that I have, not in a bad way, that I've sort of left some of myself behind in my pursuit of life, my pursuit of ambition in all sorts of different ways since probably my late teens, early 20s, that I've left something behind. And I think the question I've been asking myself is back to myself, which is what is it that I've left behind? And who is it I've left behind? And what knowing have I left behind? So it's been the last, I'd say, year ish. There's been a question that has had different language on it, which amounts to there's something you want to say to me, there's something you want to offer to me, like buddy of X years ago. What is it? And I'm beginning to hear more of that. So that's sort of the question I've been curious about living with, and yeah, having a little bit of fun around it and beginning to get some threads of answers.
That's an absolutely gorgeous inquiry. Can you just elaborate on, how that came into view for you, and just even how maybe you've explored or inquired around that?
Yeah, I think there were some practical things. It's funny when you start to ask yourself, or it's funny for me when I start to ask myself a question like that. What begins to bubble up? I think a couple of things. I think it's always been there, actually. But something you said actually on a call we were on with a group of people a while back, which was, what are you hearing that you're not giving attention to? Or it was a question that sounded like that to me. And that was just, a further nudge that I was going, oh, there it is again. And then I find myself, and this is to get very specific, but I find myself at an event about 2 months ago, and I find myself sitting beside an artist, a professional artist who I know and who I've been in the company of in different ways many times. And I'm sort of asking myself this question that I'm posing is in the background and all of a sudden comes into the foreground. And it comes in with sort of nearly in a surprising way, where I say to her, I need to spend time with you. And she looks at me with a smile and sort of says, yes, not knowing why. And I, out of knowing she created a bit of space for me to say why. And it was to explore more of my creative self, because that's one example of something I've left behind in my view. And for example in that would be when I was a child, and indeed probably early stage teenager. I had an awful lot of creative juices flowing around, and I was into music in a particular way. I was into art. I was painting, and I was believing actually that the only thing I was good at was this type of stuff. And ironically, ended up, coming in professionally, coming into a world, but also probably coming more into my head as I became older, and finding that actually when I was operating more in my head, that actually at least, and whilst I've no regrets, I was achieving a lot of things. And so I left that sort of other, what's sometimes called that sort of right brain a little bit behind me. And that's probably the loudest thing in me right now, which is how do I rekindle or go back and pick up that creative self and bring it forward and bring it into now more, which could change lots of things I do now. Not I don't necessarily just mean professionally, just change how I occupy time, how I think, but maybe sort of bring me back to myself. A greater sense of being true to who I am. That's probably the loudest aspect of what's coming up. And how it's come about is it's been emerging, to a word you use quite a bit, and I like it's sort of been emerged. And there have been little events like the ones I have described by way of example that I think I'm more conscious of recently because I've become more conscious of the question. And obviously, having this conversation with you has made me more conscious of it again. So I think I'm beginning to notice myself and notice what's around me in that context.
This is this is something I think I've noticed in your presence sometimes. Just the you use the word playful, or playing with it a bit, and it seems like there's a lovely mix of playfulness and intention to what you notice sometimes, and even in this question of how can I almost get back to myself. That's a bringing myself back to myself, by the way, is a gorgeous expression. I think there's something deeply kind of like of a homecoming or a wholeness to it, something of that nature. Really intrigued just in the moment, because I think we probably get pulses like this many times throughout our lives, and but it's there for us to pay attention to be aware of. Even when you were in the company of the artist, shall we say, like, and you've kind of sensed this or felt this for what it was. How would you even describe that feeling? Because I think this is something, I think if we were aware of even what the feeling might be, we might notice it more frequently.
Yeah, what a great question that is. I think I notice it in my ease, in my freedom, in my childlikeness, if you like. Where for me, I sort of feel that the essence of myself is very playful. I've always been mindful of that because, I was reared in, I was, very grateful for having a good upbringing and good family, good parents. But, and I'm putting a but at the end of that, there was a structure to it and there was a seriousness to it. And my dad was in a profession that he took very seriously and, for good reason, but it wasn't life and death. Um, but it sort of, as a child, felt like the serious stuff is ahead of you. So, when I was younger, I sort of gave myself permission to be more playful. I think so. I think that's feeling that sense of playfulness, a sense of like irresponsibility in the positive sense of the word, lack of responsibility, maybe lack of needing to knock an order on it, achieve something, do something. Where a lot of my life, and it's one of the things I think I've been good at. It hasn't always delivered good outcomes, but I've been good at it. Is if I set a goal, I can go get it, and therefore I have to be very careful of setting goals because I, could make the mistake of actually getting it. Um, so, so therefore, that sense of I threw it out there with no thought or plan, or and not maybe the bit that I'm sort of curious about at the minute, Mark, is no sense of huge commitment to it yet, if that makes sense. So I'm sort of going with it. And whilst I normally try and put things out like that with a sort of a sense of, well, my sense of responsibility and dare I say accountability to it, it's that sense, none of those things are around it. And I'm only, as you asked that question, having that thought now, going, oh yeah, I don't feel accountable to that. I feel that if I allow myself into the playground of that, that it'll emerge in its own way. And I don't have that artist turning around to me and pinging me texts going, "You said you were going to make contact with me, you haven't done it yet." Because I know she won't do that either. And she used a lovely phrase that, I was reminded of, but I hadn't heard it in many years, is when the heart speaks, it whispers. She used that phrase, and I thought, yeah, in other words, she was just inviting me to be with the whisper. And it's a whisper at this stage. So I like the fact that she's not chasing me down, because then I'd feel it's a thing. And gosh, I said I'd do this. I better do this. I better sort of reignite this creative self, and I better start doing things and be able to account for them in some way. So it's the opposite of that. It's a sense of, no, I've just come into the playground of it. And when I was much younger, when I mentioned music and art and things like that, I just sort of came to those things in my own way, and nobody put any boundaries or any responsibility or any accountability around that stuff. So I think, and that's a very alien environment for me.
Out of interest, just that being an alien environment, how have you even come to then this place being possible, or this place being open to play in? Like, has there been a path into that, or just does it just feel like an emergent part of your nature again, as that spontaneously has occurred with whatever is going on with your life?
Yeah, I suppose I still would describe my life in a positive way, incredibly busy. In a
Mm.
positive way, busy with lots of things, busy professionally, busy personally, busy with pastimes, busy with family, a growing family. And I mentioned to you with the last time we spoke, I've got grandkids now, which is just an utter joy. And so it's just busy. And I think I was sort of hearing a knocking on the other side of a door where something had got left behind. And there was this, I think my initial senses was, I need an antidote to busy. So that busyness can tire me out a little bit, can actually, that busyness can get boring. It's like another busy day, another busy day, another busy hour. So there was this sort of something on the other side of busyness. And that's what it was that sense of, you need to come into a different space. And in that space is not busy, and it's creative, and it's playful. And it could be sitting doing nothing in a creative way. This concept even of boredom is the essence of innovation or creativity. It was, and that's a scary place for me, because I'm very used to busy. Um, so I think that's what it was, and it always felt like there was something knocking on the other side of a door, and I was going there. I'm hearing something. I think I know what it is, but will I actually go to the door and open it? Will I actually say anything? Will I look inside? And I think I've gotten to open the door. I've looked in. I've probably taken a peep in and sort of put out a few things like I've described. I haven't done a whole lot more than that yet.
This is a glorious expression, though, the kind of bored of the busyness. I think that I had a really interesting experience this weekend. I was just going to Hamburg with my to see my in-laws, and my wife had already gone ahead of me with our daughter, so it was just me and the dog. And I had a train ride where I'd intentionally left my laptop behind, and there was nothing I was going to read. I was just going to sit there, and I don't know. There was something incredibly full about the moment. Do you know what I mean? Like, there was something either in just noticing my emotions, my reactions, my thoughts, the landscapes, paying attention to people in there. I was kind of stunned by how full the moment on that train felt. And I don't know, there's something about, because I don't think the way even the way you're describing the, busyness with family, busyness with things you want to do, busyness with work that you enjoy. It's a very interesting notion that we could even get bored of busyness of stuff that is even meaningful, or that is actually something that you've chosen.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, I can relate to that. It's like the idea of doing, like, it's funny, here we are coming out of an Easter weekend. And as we were coming into the Easter weekend, I was listening to somebody talking about here in Ireland, the weather that was looking like we were going to have. And my we were going up to Donegal, and my daughter and her fiance were coming up. And we noticed that the weather forecast, because we often spend a lot of time in the outdoor, just strolling the beaches and stuff. And we noticed the weather forecast was very poor. And it was like a relief that actually, now we did get out and about, but it was actually the concept that actually we'd have do nothing, that we would actually chill out and do nothing. At one level, really excited me. When I didn't give it much thought, I was innately sort of excited by that, and then at another level there was trepidation, which is like, what's going to happen? Are we all going to suffer from cabin fever here? Um, it emerged that there was a bit of both, and it was lovely. But it was just that, yeah, that piece at the start, um, which was, my gosh, we could end up doing nothing. How exciting is that? Another thought that strikes me is I was smiling to myself today, before I came on this call, because I left the house this morning, and quite unusually got to my destination for a client visit, to find I'd left my phone at home for the third time in about 2 weeks. And I thought, that's really interesting. And I wasn't leaving the house frazzled. It was just I casually left the phone at home. And there was a moment of, what do you do without the phone? And so, instinctively you get into these silly places like, I'll ring my wife to tell her I've left the phone at home. No, you won't. And then all of a sudden you go, maybe you can just operate without the phone for a few hours. But it felt like a liberation at one level, and an utterly frightening thing at another level. But it was there's nothing new in that per se, intellectually, to hear somebody like me talk to it. It was being with it, which was really interesting. You sort of go, this is the third time this has happened. I think I'm getting a bit used to this. And I was being amused by it. So when you're talking about your train journey, that sort of reminds me of just today. I've done that. And then what I was left wondering is, the universe just sort of dropping a few little things to say, play with that one for a while, see how you get on. Because there were moments of nothingness. For example, traveling from one meeting to the next, I arrived to my meeting early. What do I typically do? After I look at the phone and see what I can do on the phone, in my diary or in my task list or whatever it might be. And there was nothing there. So I just sat and watched the world, or just sat. I actually did a little bit of just being present, and, be with my breathing. And what a gift it was. And I knew it, that in the highest order of things, I was doing the highest thing.
Right.
But I also knew if I had the phone in front of me, I may not be doing that. In fact, if I was being really honest, I'm not evolved yet enough to do that when there's something more compelling to be done. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's I've written about it and talked about it on this podcast. Even just the practice of really not turning on my phone at all at this
Mm,
point, but it is purely because of what you've described. I don't think I'm evolved enough to have it in my vicinity and to just allow this, if you want to call this highest order expression of what we could be doing with our time.
mm,
And I think it's almost that powerful. So I find the absence almost of it opens up the space for it in my experience. And I love, I don't know, I wonder, is it the universe, or is there even some quiet intention going on with this quiet knocking at the door? I'm really
yes.
intrigued, Dave, that sense of knowing that there's a knocking or even a whisper at the door, kind of an awareness that the door is opening, and even then just this feeling out of it at the moment. You mentioned earlier, like and even just with the sense of silence, or nothingness, or doing nothing at the weekend, both the sense of excitement and maybe even a hesitation around that. Just really intrigued from your experience, how do you find kind of not bridging those experiences, but just feeling both of those things? Like, how do you even kind of make sense of that?
I, yeah. How do I make sense of it? It's like, the only sense I can make of it, now that I think about that question, is it's sort of the difference between. There was a phrase I heard recently which I loved, and it was I was going to see somebody who looks after my sort of physical state, and she does various therapies on me, which is beautiful. It's a Matsu, and I'm sure many of your listeners will know that. But that what that therapy is about, and I find it really useful. And I met her recently, and I we were just chatting before we started, and I said, "How are you?" And she looked a little bit, not, I wouldn't say stressed, but she looked different. And so I checked. I just said, "How are you?" And she says, "I'm trying to balance the needs of my ego and the needs of my soul." And I thought, well, that's really interesting. So I think to answer your question, it's sort of like the needs of my soul say something to me. I sometimes hear those, and then the needs of my ego, I hear those, and that's how I now try to hear stuff. And I don't dismiss one or the other. Like, the most typical one to dismiss would be to say, "Oh, ego needs, forget them," and it's all about the soul. I think it's about balance for me. I think, I have ego needs that are good and healthy, but when I overindulge in them, they're not. I don't know that I've ever overindulged in the needs of my soul, to be honest. I'm sure it's doable, but I haven't done it. I don't feel I have done it. So for me, how I hear it is when I'm out of balance. It's like I hear it, and often I hear it and I go, "Yeah, we're all good here." It's so I try and sort of conceive of it that way, if that makes sense.
Oh, this absolutely makes sense. And once again, this is just I think, an utterly gorgeous concept, like the idea of balancing the needs of my ego and soul. When you've said you've checked in on that before, and the answer may just simply be, "Yeah, we're all good here." How do you, like? Is that just a simple enough kind of check in? Is that like, is there a field? Do you notice its presence when maybe the ego needs have superseded what would be a useful state to you, or how have you kind of played with that balance, I guess?
Yeah, I think when I'm experiencing a discomfort, at any level, when I'm experiencing a discomfort, if the way I operate, it's generally there's something that my soul needs that I'm not paying attention to, and it could be as simple as it needs a bit of quiet time. I need to spend time differently with my wife or my kids or myself. Or I just need to, I live on the edge of the Dublin mountains here. I need to get up into the mountains. I just need to go for a walk. It could even be to do with how I'm managing my body. It could be anything. It could be even in the nature of the work I do, is that, I can the nature of my work can take me into conversations that are very soulful. That's the way I would describe them. They're very, below the line, earthed, really, you really connecting with another individual and exploring things at a very sort of deep level. And then there's other times, like I have done this morning, I've been into what I would call much more business meetings about goals and achievements and ambitions and how far are we getting on the journey, etc. So I find that's easy for me to do. But if I do too much of that, this is just an example of work, that I get very in my head and in that sort of way. And if I did a lot of that, I'd find a nice meditation is a nice rebalance for me, or a nice just, I'll go for a walk for an hour and without the phone and be with myself and my body on the walk and the nature around me and listening to the birds and, paying attention to the smells and so on. So, yeah, so my imbalance, the only one I'm really watch out for is that just getting too in my head and getting too needy for some of the wrong reasons, like not having enough. And, if I earn more, then it'll all be resolved. And, all of those sort of obvious things. Or if I'm recognized more, or if I win another client, then everything that'll make it a good day, or a good week, or whatever it might be. So just getting too wired in that way.
Have you, Dave, just have have you always have you found it easy to be responsive to life? Like, from even just listening to you there, and from what I've even heard from you in previous encounters, there seems to be quite a capacity you have to actually notice, but then also even take some degree of or change course or respond to what's required. Has that been something that's kind of come naturally to you, or is that something that you work on?
No,
Or how would you
yeah,
describe
what a great question that is. I've never thought about this. But I would say yes and no, and it's the yes bit. I've always had help, so I was very fortunate when in back in 1983, and I was 21 years of age. I was very fortunate in that my he became my father-in-law, said you need a business coach. And back in 1983, certainly here in Ireland, nobody had a business coach, and there was one, and he was here in Dublin, a great guy called Dennis Cahill, and he became a sounding board for me that I could hear myself, and I could be held accountable, and I could listen to my own madness, and I could be called out on stuff, at least to consider it. So that was incredibly valuable for me. So I think what the net effect of that was over time around, goals and things I had is it raised my consciousness. I became more conscious because frankly I didn't have to be more conscious for anyone except myself, except in that environment. So that definitely helped. And then along the journey, I've had all sorts of other people around me that I've sort of brought in around me to help me with things I feel I need help with. So yes, in that context. No, in that there have been and still are deep underlying patterns in my self that are constant work-ons, and the most known one, if there are people who know me listening to this, so that I don't bullshit you, excuse the phrase, is I will take on too much, and I want to grab everything, in a good way. I don't mean I need to earn all the money in the world. It's not that type of grabbing, but I want to do everything. I want to pack the day full of everything. I want to say yes to everything, which generally is good. But I do run aground, and I have run aground, and I got myself into difficulty during COVID, where I really didn't look after myself after getting COVID, and ended up with a sort of a 6 month tail on it, which wasn't very nice. But that was of my own doing, and I learned how to recover. And I learned better how to listen to my body. And I got some great advice from medical doctors, quite frankly, who are friends of mine, who off the sort of more off the record said, this is all about your nervous system. And you need to learn how to calm the whole thing down. And it's not that I go around, noticeably jumpy and nervy, but I know what I live with. And I can be on a lot, and that on tends to be people like it. They go, God, he's good to be around, and he makes good contribution, and that type of stuff. But when you're living with it and you're always on, then sometimes that's really problematic. So that's my constant work on, and it has been since I was a kid. Like my mother would tell you the same when I was young, is that I would once or twice a year just run myself into the ground. So that's an old pattern that I'm still in the learning stages of trying to get. I'm much better at it than I used to be, and I've obviously adopted lots of very well-known practices to manage my nervous system and meditate and all of those things, which are now daily practices. But I've still a long way to go. So that's stuff that sometimes comes up and just sort of hits me in the back of the head, and you go, oh. I still haven't figured this one out, and I have to go to the next stage of it and the next stage of it. And I love learning from others. I love watching people who, in my view, do that a whole lot better than I do. My wife, for example, is very good at being still, being calm, going easy, and yet she can get out and do lots of things and achieve lots of things. But her tempo, if there was a rev counter on me, the rev counter is often too close to the red. Sometimes it's in the red, but it's not cruising enough. And so that go easy idea is often something I'm reminding to myself. Ease is a good idea. It doesn't have to be easy, but go with ease so that it isn't dis-ease. So that was sort of a play on words. But yeah, so that's a work on for me. So that's why I say yes and no.
This can you give me a sense, just because the way you described it there, and fully appreciating the way in which that can serve you in just the presence, your presence, and going out into the world. But just when you said like I have to live with, I live with this, and always the sense of always kind of being on. How would you even? And you've described it quite nicely, I think, already, even with the rev counter and maybe coming aground a couple of times every so often and then and going again. But what do you sense is in you in that? Like, is it, you've mentioned goals a couple of times, but there also seems to be a healthy or a lot of consciousness around when that becomes unhealthy. But just from your perspective, what do you think is driving you?
Oh, I'm so I'm at the minute. I'm pretty sure I know the answer, but then if you and I chatted in 2 years' time, I might say, forget about what I said 2 years ago. It's something else. So
Yeah.
my current answer to that is self acceptance. It's a deep rooted self acceptance. I can say things like, "I am enough and I have enough," and then if you said to me, "Do you believe that? Do you embody that? Does every fiber of your being know that?" Particularly that last bit I said, I'd say no, in all honesty. But do I embody it more than I used to? Yes. Am I more conscious of it? Yes. Am I working on it? Yes. Is it wrecking my head? No. Is it making me unhappy? No. So I think it's a self acceptance piece, which I think partly it's like part of that is just how I think, and I have to, be as conscious of that as I can to the extent that it might disable me. And I think part of it is just how I was marinated in early life and at home, where I often didn't feel, particularly in the years I can remember in my early teenage years, I didn't feel enough. I didn't feel accepted. Um, I don't blame anyone for that. That's just how I felt. So the striving, always striving, um, is something I was good at. So, when I got the opportunity and got a fair chance at striving and a fair chance at achieving, and to be able to find things I liked doing, I actually realized, whoa, actually, I'm pretty good at this. But what was driving it, I think what drives it a lot, or was driving it a lot, was that self acceptance. Now I would say a love of life, a love of what I do, a love of the roles I can play in life and the contribution I can make and the purpose, very clear. I'm very clear about my purpose in life. Um, but acceptance is also there. It's there as an ingredient. And I'd still like it to be dialed a little lower. It's nice to have a tinge of it, I think, but it's still, if you could put numbers on these things and it added up to 100% of what's sort of getting you out of bed in the morning or getting you to do anything, then I think that one could still be a bit lower. Yeah.
And just from your perspective, how do you sense that as that's even just shaped how you've approached life yourself? Then even the sense of, look, you're not saying it's somebody else's responsibility, but even just the acknowledgement of like, in my teens I did feel this, for whatever reason it might be. How has that kind of shaped even how you see life or how you approach life?
Well, first of all, I think it's been a great asset at one level because it's got me, I sort of struggled through school life, out of lack of interest as much as anything else. Like there was things I was good at. I was good at sports. I was good at art and things like that. But the narrative was, well, that's not going to get you too far, and so this thing was say, right, I better apply myself to something that I can achieve other things in my life, my own financial independence or my own just independence, frankly. I that helped me a lot, so I could. I would have had and probably still have a reputation of having a good engine, being resilient, just always there, always in the game, always achieving things, being really consistent, being motivated. I would have had my motivations have probably moved from 25, 30 years ago to now best described as, a fear of lack of to a belief in abundance. I think I'm more driven by abundance, and you can have everything. And I don't mean, every piece of money you want, but you can have a really good life. You can, it's there. Yeah, absolutely believe that. So the fear of lack of doesn't really bother me anymore. If you met me 25 years ago, that would have been a big driver in me. So I don't know if I've answered your question directly, but that's
Yeah.
so it's been an asset and a liability, but probably more. I'm not sure I'd change a lot, to be honest, because if I wasn't driven that way, I've never contemplated how would life have gone if I wasn't driven like that. Like if I was a person that said, sure, everything will work out, or if I had a different motive for what I was doing, would I been as creative? Because I'm often find I'm at my creative best when the risks are high. That's how I'm wired.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, the risks are high here, right? You better be very creative to navigate your way through this thing. And I found, wow, I am very creative when push comes to shove. And I know everyone's not like that. So, in a crisis, whether in typically this has happened in work life rather than in personal life, I generally somebody you want in the room, because I switch on rather than switch off.
Yeah, and just to say as well, like I think, and I've interviewed too many people at this point that will point to something, and in some cases point to something that could be considered far more detrimental, almost in their life or upbringing, than even what you're alluding to here. That they are still absolutely grateful for how that shaped them and the
Mm,
person they've become. I think we have far too simplistic a view almost in like, oh well, if I just extricate that part of
yeah.
my upbringing and I had this instead, that it would be something wonderful, or that you wouldn't lose something in it. I've noticed it too much in my own personal life, in moments where I'm like, well, if that hadn't have happened, who would I even be? Like, so I definitely hear what you're saying there. Really intrigued from your point of view, the sense though of, I like how you described abundance. It's not like that you can have every piece of money in the world in order to feel that. But just from your perspective, what in your life what would be the cornerstones of that feeling of abundance?
Oh, for me, it very clearly, unequivocally comes back to a sense of being loved and knowing you're lovable, being able to love others. Fundamentally, that's where it's about. And then that manifesting in, relationships, you know, with people, with nature, that sense of connectedness. That's for me where it's all about. I remember probably the best thing that ever happened to me was to go through the massive financial uncertainty of the financial crash 15, 16 years ago. And I happened to be in that industry and happened to be in a part of that industry where you couldn't but be very plugged into it personally, as not just in terms of your own personal finances, but your entire career. So to be in that at that moment in time and having everything in that sense you thought was certain, not me. Thankfully, family, relationships were all good and they were unaffected by any of that, and never looked like they were going to be affected by any of that. So it never caused me any concern. But everything else was seriously affected. Um, and I think it helped me understand I'm still okay, and I'm still loved, and I'll still sleep tonight, and I'll still eat tomorrow. And I had an amazing experience a couple of years prior to it, where through another thing I had gotten involved in and had founded with a bunch of people, I found myself in the Mathari slum and the Kibera slum in Nairobi, which are two of the worst places you'll ever go to in this planet in terms of human existence, and found, incredible hardship and very difficult things to see. But I also found people who were okay, in that very human sense. And after I said to a few of them back then, you're more okay than a lot of people I know in Ireland who actually, if they were on social welfare, even in relative terms, will be living a far more comfortable life than you'll ever imagine to live down here, yet they're not nearly as okay. And to a degree, I was saying it of myself. So
Yeah,
that experience was very valuable for me to understand how what we need to be okay. And another quick story I'll share with you is I was in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, many years ago with a couple of people, and we met this lady who had worked in at the front line of wars, for example, in Bosnia and various other places, doing sort of emergency relief work. And she was in Bangladesh at this time, but she uttered a word, a sentence to us, which echoes in my mind still. And it's a really simple sentence. And she looked on us with pity as she stood there in her worn out sandals and a sarong, and no window in the space for a window in her office, and a fan trying to keep the extreme heat off us. And she looked at us sadly and said, "All of you people in the West need so much to be happy."
Yeah.
And I just remember hearing it straight. She didn't mean it in a patronizing way. She genuinely meant it out of sadness for us. As you know, we had flown over in a fancy plane and blah, blah, blah. And I went, and I knew I was hearing the truth because we just sat there nodding like you're nodding now. The three of us just sat there and said, like, there's nothing to be said here. You've just heard the truth. And you just need to sit with it and see it as a magic moment of truth and see what you do with it. And that's constantly since this. So that's 20 years ago. That's still seeping in.
Well, I think that's I think that's profoundly important, and it's definitely an inquiry of mine in terms of I find it's far more interesting to see how little I need to feel contentment rather than chasing every possible trinket, bells and whistles and everything else. I think there's something in us that if you look at the state of comfort that we experience in the Western world, that even, if the barista tells people that the coffee machine is broken, and you see people's groans and moans about having to wait for a coffee, you kind of get a sense of, wow, there's something very strange going on here in terms of what our expectations are of this life. You also touched on something there that resonates deeply with me. Over the last 7 years, I've had the experience of earning by far and away the most I've ever earned in a year, my last year in finance, to times in the last few years earning by far and away less, the least that I've ever earned in my professional life. And there's a huge gift in not know or in knowing that didn't ultimately alter or affect my sense of being or relationship in the world. I genuinely
Yeah, yeah.
think that there's a considerable liberation in knowing that. You said something though that I also thought was really interesting. Just while going through considerable crisis in terms of what this means financially or the implications of what something could be, you spoke with great certainty about, or a knowing almost in the sense of family. Just curious from your perspective of like what cultivated that for you, or
Mm.
what you think has even contributed to that. You mentioned in terms of where you feel abundance is in relationships as well. So maybe even just to elaborate on in that area as well.
Yeah, I think the deficit I was feeling when I was in my mid-teens was in essence a lack of feeling loved. Now I say that my mum and my dad loved me, I know that, but I think there's a difference between that and feeling loved. So I didn't feel it, and I don't think I felt it. Maybe I didn't have a capacity to, I'm not sure, but I didn't feel it in pretty much most or any part of my life. So I felt quite isolated. Now, that being said, I wouldn't, if you met me when I was 15 or 16, I'm absolutely sure I wouldn't have articulated it that way. So there's a bit of post hoc rationalizing that, in that, yeah, that's what it was.
Right.
Um, so I think a lot of my life from then to now has been to be accepted and be loved. Um, and, without a doubt, the most important thing that ever happened to me was meeting my wife. Who happened to be the boss's daughter at the time. I was having a summer job, and there was this sense of, for as sort of what's the word? I felt I didn't feel connected to many things back then. Probably was little bit lost. I was absolutely certain this lady was going to be my girlfriend very quickly, and quite quickly became certain I'm going to marry this lady. This is my soulmate I'm after meeting. My gosh, I'm very young, but it doesn't matter. It's happened now. And like people would, and I began to articulate that a couple of years in, and people would say, how do you know? And I go, what a silly question. I don't know how I know. I just know. But there was very few things I was certain about at that time, but that's what I was certain. So I think that was to do with, this is somebody I can love, that I do love. This is somebody who loves me and will love me unconditionally. And then I've just sort of drawn in around that, your kids, obviously, that's just been a fantastic relationship, and lots of friends and others since. Say lots, it's not hundreds. So that's been that's been a huge factor. And remind me, and sorry, Mark, remind me the exact. I'm answering that question, and then I'm going, what was the question he asked me again?
No,
Have I answered it?
it was, yeah, no, you absolutely answered it in spades. The question was, well, you've definitely given the formation or foundation of it. It was going through, because I worked in banking at the time in the
Mm,
financial crisis. Now I was in my mid 20s, but I saw even a lot of the senior people that would have, a lot was riding on it as well at that stage. Um, just how you felt, so that your family life, you kind of alluded to it, feeling untouched by that, and I just thought that sounded like quite a unique thing to be able to say, and so I was just curious as to
yeah,
what
I
contributed to
think there was
that.
a bit of a vacuum as well. My relationship with my siblings was always functional and good. It's very close now. It probably was less close then, but there was nothing negative in it. So I think for me, there was a vacuum, and it was like filling that vacuum. And I knew that even through the financial crises, that was just rock solid. I absolutely knew that the foundations were rock solid. I didn't need to give it much thought. I wasn't being complacent about it either. It's like, that was something I would always give time to invest in, but it was the part of my life that was rock solid. And with that being rock solid, I knew it doesn't really matter. And we used to say things like, well, if everything goes pear shaped, we'll be together, and we'll be fine when we're together. And we are fine together. So that's it. And we used to, my middle boy was always into Monty Python, and he'd have this. There was a fame, this song about or there's a sketch about living in a cardboard box. And he said, if we have to live in a cardboard box, Dad, we'll be fine. Yeah. And actually, I was going, yeah, we will actually. We'll be fine in a cardboard box. And that's could sound disrespectful to some who live on the street, who I've worked with in my past as well. But it was a good analogy for it. Doesn't matter. We'll be okay if we're together. And I think we kept conscious of that. We were in a humorous sort of way, trying not to take that for granted, and actually say we matter. Being together matters. Tuning into each other matters. Reminding each other of our love for each other matters. And we 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 do that now, and we did that then, and we were probably a bit more vulnerable, or I certainly felt a bit more vulnerable back then. So I was acutely aware of how important that was to me for my sort of emotional and psychological well-being.
I think you're touching on, though, something staggeringly kind of important, and even what that lady was alluding to with this in this office without the window, with the aircon or the fan trying to do the impossible. There's something, I think, even how you would use the term abundance, and then relating to relationships. I think there is, it's not to say that we shouldn't strive. There's something very naturally human about growth and, moving into spaces, or becoming something. Like, there's something very human about this too, when it doesn't become too egoic a thing. And yet at the same time too, there's also just this kind of awareness that, like, without, or the priority, I guess, of what will make me feel, potentially enough, or what would allow me to feel loved, I think the way you speak about family and articulated that sounds just, it feels profoundly insightful in terms of what can at least be the thing that allows us to strive or whatever else, if that is, or even to move into uncertainty and to explore and express, that if there's that foundation of family in the way, or love in the way that you speak of it.
Mm. And it's funny, we look very proudly in our three kids who are, well into their adulthood now, at how what's important to them, and that's fundamental to them. And I think to a large degree that's what they've witnessed. So I've never, I've, even as I'm describing this to you now, I'm not sure that I've ever articulated that openly to anybody, because typically not asked these questions in this way. So it's what's really interesting and valuable even for me in this conversation is nearly to become a little more conscious of these things. But in many ways, I'm glad that I didn't stand up and make any speeches about it in the family, or I might have just killed it all off. So I
Yeah.
think it's what they've embodied to a large degree. There was I'm going back, say, 12 years, no, more than 12 years ago. I'm going back about 18 years ago. And my wife, or my daughter, I beg your pardon, was about 12 at the time. And I had come back from Bangladesh. And I had taken a few photographs of a particular community in the jungles in Bangladesh that we had gone to visit for a few days. And this community had never seen cameras. They had never seen people from this part of the world. They'd never seen people that weren't their own race and color. And we spent a day with them. And I came back with photographs. And there was one particular photograph, which was a load of young kids in sarongs. They all looked about, say, between the age of 4 and 12. And they were smiling as they were just smiles into the camera that would just make you smile. Just like it was about, say, 20 kids, all smiling. It's the happiest smiles you could see. And my daughter is 12 and she's looking at it and she goes, "Dad, what are they smiling at?" And I said, "What do you think they're smiling at?" And I didn't have an answer. Like, I mean, they were smiling because they saw a camera at them and were probably going to get a chance to be able to see themselves back in the camera because they were iPhones at the time. But she looked at them, all of these faces on the screen, and she said, "They're smiling because they have each other." And I said,
Hmm.
"Yeah, that's exactly it. Like, what more do they need? Look, they've all got bare feet on, sarongs, but they're together and they're safer together. And that's all they know, being together. And they probably assume there's a belly full of food coming up in the next couple of hours and they're okay. That's it. That's them. And they're probably happier than most of the kids here on this side of the world." And she goes, "Oh yeah, they definitely look at Dad." And it was so obvious. Like, I mean, when I asked Katie those questions, I wasn't surprised by the answer because you were getting a very soulful answer. It was a very visceral human answer. And so we know this stuff, and my kids knew this stuff. And part of the reason I was asking her is I wanted her to remind herself she knew that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And I don't know. I think that there's just, it's kind of absurd to the point that we've got to in society, in terms of all the ways we've kind of glorified doing it yourself, or going it alone, or moving out of home as quickly as possible. Like, there's so many things that we attribute, like, it's almost like we're going out of our way to isolate ourselves, and we're glorifying that as well. And yet, really, when you strip it back, all like the connection is almost. I read this beautiful thing recently where somebody said something to the effect of, maybe you're not enough on your own, but that's even more the reason to kind of get entangled with one another. And I think there's something beautifully, what you're sharing there kind of reminds me of that. And even in the acknowledgement, or even in the kind of the joking around, will we end up having to live somewhere else, and this kind of thing, like, there is just, it's still with a reminder of what's important. And I think that's what, from what clearly has affected you on your travels, it's the same for me spending time in India or other parts of the world for extended periods of time. We've kind of lost sight of of that, or we've even just it's a stunning thing to be in the presence of people that, according to our values, our hierarchy of how we're going after things, you couldn't be happy with that. And yes, and not to play loose and fast with what someone else's interpretation of their life is, but I've witnessed joy. Like there's no fooling me whether I've been in the presence of joy or not, and I've been in the presence of joy in situations that we possibly couldn't even comprehend. So
Yes.
no, I think there's something very there's something very true or rings true to what you're saying.
Yeah,
Just
I think we're at an, maybe we're always in various, maybe this is a constant tension, but it's, a way of looking at lots of things that are going on, even geopolitically right now, could be described as people wanting to come together, understanding, in my view, that everything is connected to everything else in all sorts of different ways at a human, level and every other level. And then there is the opposite to that. And my view of the world is that you defy gravity when you try and start pulling things apart, because they're innately connected. Everything is connected. Nobody survives without other people. No business thrives without other businesses. No happiness and joy exists on your own, completely on your own, in the more general sense of the word. Yes, I've always felt, and I'm grateful for it. I've always felt very connected, very part of the world, and I've tried to contribute to that as best I can. But I've always felt very part of it and very part of the human race, and not just my family, but like lots of friends, lots of people I've gotten to know, including yourself, Mark. It just, but even on this conversation with you, what a beautiful way to spend time. It's just two of us connecting. Some people are going to watch it and listen to it, which is also nice to know. But for me, it's just as simple as that. And it would, a lot of what I do in life would be utterly meaningless on my own. That doesn't mean spending time on your own isn't a good thing. From time to time, it is, but it's about the whole thing for me. And I think it's always been like that, and I think that's how my life has always felt a bit better. Is I feel I've been more connected as time has gone on, and the choices I've made in my personal life, in my career and professional life, has been always lent into being more connected, more contributing, learning from that, contributing to that, all that type of stuff. I've just loved it, and I love bringing people into that sort of place in themselves and in amongst others to make great things happen. And that's when I see lots of joy. Is generally is in that sort of context.
just glancing at the time there, Dave, just given what you've been describing, even just this initial kind of inquiry into, is there some part of myself that I've left behind, or this sense of even moving into more of myself or coming back to myself, this in a very playful and open way that too. And you've even kind of contrasted that a little bit maybe with some of the accountability or structure that other inquiries might have, but also being very grateful for your capacity to be able to set targets and to be accountable and to move in the directions that you've intended to. But also this great openness to, noticing the balance in yourself. Like, when is it too much ego? Is my soul in more need of attention? Even as you opened up with an inquiry kind of around creativity and acknowledging more creativity in your past, and a curiosity or an openness around what's knocking at the door, and stepping into that. Even ideas of leaving the phone behind sometimes, or maybe even a weekend that might involve nothingness. And even if there could be a busy or a boredom in the busyness. And so there's always, this seems to be like a really active responsiveness, or paying attention to life in whatever state or flow it may be in. Then these lovely, really beautiful acknowledgements just around the significance of connection, the abundance that's possible in our life, knowing even from your own experience in childhood with a sense of like, oh, did I feel I was loved? Even, you're saying that feeling is also just your own experience, your own interpretation of things, how that's moved forward in terms of just and I'd love to chat with you again at maybe another point, just about that feeling of knowing around meeting your wife, even at such a young age, and to have
Mm.
such clarity, but just that kind of bright beacon of love and the unconditional sense of it, and even how that's fueled many things in your life, and even how you go about family, and you speak about that in such a, I think, a wonderfully connected and loving way as well. To just noting the significance of connection in life far beyond your family, even through your an expression of your work, how you show up with people in general, and then just this lovely kind of questions of, wondering what is enough for people, and this lady in this office, and just sprinkling kind of these moments, of these seminal moments that, as you say, continue to echo through time for you. Really curious to ask you question, Dave, the question of what is a good life for you?
I think, well, for me, I mean, it is something I have thought about. I mean, I've thought about it outside of the context of knowing that was one of the questions you were going to ask. And for me, it's still being able to do my best to show the way without even knowing it sometimes for others, inspire them, maybe energize them, maybe awaken them. Um, and enable them. So if I can contribute, I love actively engaging. I'm not a control freak, so I'm quite hands off, and was quite hands off with our kids, for example. And I run a business, and I call it enable, which means to make able. So I love the idea of basking in the reflected glory of saying, I think I might have helped awaken something that has got them on their way, wherever their way is. So I never ever felt inclined to say, you should go there, you should do that. I mean, if that was the case, I guess my three kids would be working in financial services now, and they don't. Um, so I love the idea of inspiring. I love the idea of enabling, and I also love the idea of challenging people to pass it on. So for me, those are the three things. So doing the same for others. So if and probably at the heart of that is something I learned, that sorry struck me when I was down in Bangladesh all those years ago. Was we asked, we were sponsoring a project that was around microcredit, which is essentially these micro loans that are typically given to women in extreme poverty, so that they can, for example, buy hens and sell the eggs in the market, so they can begin to sustain themselves. That's just an example. And we asked a community of women, after many years of getting a little micro loan and getting themselves on their feet, what has it meant to you? And the answer I got was obvious, but it wasn't obvious to me at the time. And the answer was, you helped us get our dignity back. And I would say a good life for me is anything I can do to help people have a greater sense of dignity. And that can be anybody, because I think that's what a wonderful thing to be able to do. And I believe that the work I do professionally, attempts to do that. Hence, enabling is about dignity. It's not about I could go in and do it. It's about you can do it. Um, and I realized when I reflected on my life many years ago, that's actually where I get my joy from. That's where I get that's my thing, if you like. So that could be rearing my kids. It could be the friendships I have. It could be the smallest moments to the biggest moments. And sometimes you have to be the badass to do that. Sometimes you have to say, no, actually, I'm going to challenge you to step in there to do that. Um, so yeah, that for me, and I think I do a bit of that. I think I get a little bit better at it every day. So that would be a good life for me, is if I can just keep doing that. Then I think that'll might even appear in my eulogy one day. if I prompt somebody.
That notion, though, of a good life being one where you help other people experience that sense of dignity, that, I don't know, I just felt like some sort of moistness in my eyes, and I heard that. I think there's something so deeply human, and I don't know, just wonderfully human about that sentiment. And just in terms of how you say you approach life, I think one of the things I've enjoyed a number of times in your presence really is just the sheer embodiment of what you're suggesting too. So, look, Dave, this whole conversation has been an absolute joy for me once more. As
Likewise.
I mentioned at the opening, the reason why I asked you on to this was just basically based on your self awareness, your approach to life, your constant inquiry, the playfulness, a mixture of a whole number of things. I thought there's a very good life here to share. So I'm really grateful to have had you on the podcast here today, Dave.
Oh, thanks, Mark, and thanks for asking me questions that have created some new thoughts for me as well, sort of new levels of consciousness around a few things. It's been really helpful. So thanks, I appreciate it.